Well, I'm Tom Sampson. I'm the chief of Calgary's Emergency Management Agency, which is an agency operating with 46 partners here in Calgary, Alberta.
Okay, thanks. And could you then talk about your experience in going up to Slave Lake? I know that you got a call to go up and were asked to take on one role, and then that transformed into something else. So talk about that initial call and then
Sure.
your role in the events.
You bet. Well, we got a call. My background is medical. I used to be the chief of the emergency medical services here in Calgary, and I have a team known as Canada Task Force 2, one of the heavy urban search and rescue teams that has a medical component. In essence, has a field hospital. And I got a call one night, and the request was, we'd like you to take your Canada Task Force team and head to Whitecourt, Alberta, and set up a field hospital there because they're evacuating people out of Slave Lake. Can you do that, and how quickly can you be on the ground? And so that was a late Sunday night, and we drove through the night with my team and arrived at Whitecourt first thing in the morning, sort of about a 5:30 arrival. And it's one of those things. I arrived in town and nobody knew we were coming. We walked into the Emerge, and luckily I've done those kind of things before. But when we walked into Emerge, the head nurse said, no, we don't have a problem. We don't really need you, and everything's fine. And so I called back to Calgary and asked, what is it that you'd like me to do? And they said, well, then head to Slave Lake. The whole town's on fire. And of course, we've been on the road and not hearing all the details. So we got on the road again and started driving for Slave Lake. And keep in mind, we haven't been to bed yet. So we drove through the night and got in at 5 in the morning. And we drove into Slave Lake. And of course, as we were driving up, heavy smoke and those sorts of things. And I reported to the EOC and sort of introduced myself as Tom Sampson. I'm from Calgary, and there's something I can do to help. And the response from the CAO and others at the time was, well, you're here to take over, didn't you know? And I gave them that look of kind of horror, and it still gives you a little tinge down the back of your neck. And I looked at him and said, I'm here to take over. And some guy walked up to me quite harried, and he said, I've been working for 48 hours straight. I don't even know what's going on anymore. You need to take over. And that was it. That was the start of Slave Lake. It was myself and another fellow by the name of Ken McMullen. And we were set up in a room that was probably 6 feet wide or 7 feet wide by about 15 feet long. Not really the kind of EOC that I'm used to, that has 64 seats and is, has a bunch of technology. And so we started the process of taking over, but there was no transfer of command, as you would study or your students would study in ICS. No sort of pre-briefing or anything else. It became, sort of the Sherlock Holmes thing. We've got to figure this out. We've got to find out where they're at, what they're doing, and through the night, we worked and tried to come up to speed as to what was exactly going on. And of course, ourselves, we hadn't slept now for about 36 hours. And so, we'd gone all the previous day and right through the night and into the next day. And so we were fairly tired ourselves, but we got a base established and we got some command processes in place. And we established incident command systems that we could allow reporting. And I recall the first night sort of going to bed and saying, you've got to get us into a new center. We can't be here in this room. It just doesn't work. We didn't have situational awareness whatsoever. We didn't know what parts of town had burned or hadn't burned. We didn't have maps. We didn't have the capacity to really understand. And of course, I'm a real fan of Micah Ensley, who talks about situational awareness predominantly in the airline industry. And, you talk about, you have to have a perception of what's occurring, that comprehension to know what that means to you. And then from that, you can project where you're going. And we didn't have that the first night. And so we got about 6 hours sleep, and we came back in the next morning, and they said, I said, well, what do you want me to do today? And they said, we want you to be in charge. And it was an interesting thing because we had, two communities there, so two different councils, and we had a First Nations band. And so I kind of looked at them and I said, I can do this. However, here's the deal. You're going to hire me every day. You're going to fire me at the end of the shift every day. And if I come back in the next day, I'm going to ask you if I'm hired again. But when you hire me, you're giving me the authority to make decisions on behalf of the local authorities. We're not going to have, it's not going to be a debate with the members of your councils and the second council and the First Nations members. If you say that you're it for the day, I'm it for the day, and you can fire me at any time you want. But in essence, I apologize. We have an emergency situation here. We need to make decisions. And so they agreed to that. And for the next 14 days we were there, I was fired every day and hired every morning to come back. And so began Slave Lake.
Thanks. There's just a pause. I have to take myself off of mute each time. Okay. So if you could
I don't lose you on view, actually. I don't lose you on view. But okay, I don't lose you. Okay.
Yeah, no.
So I just thought I'd give you a chance to ask questions if you wanted to direct it, Jean.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. So that's really helpful in terms of giving that context. So you've talked about there being no situational awareness. Can you talk about what your sense of the priorities were and just how that situational awareness evolved in those first few days?
Well, in terms of the priorities, you might be a little bit surprised as to what they were. We had the town closed down, and so the town on all perimeters was locked down, and we had probably about, at that point, 400 responders there, and it swelled very quickly up to about 1,500. And the first priority, obviously, was all the life safety issues. But another first priority, as much as you can say that, is we actually didn't have food. And so the first meal that we got, when we did get a meal, was out of our 72-hour kit that we carry in our vehicles. But the feeding of the masses was actually sort of bread and meat, and that was it. There's no mayonnaise, no condiments, no anything else. And so while we were doing the life safety things on one hand and saying we had active fires burning and we needed to put them out, at the same time, no army marches without food in its stomach. And so our huge priority was to set up a basic infrastructure to feed people and to house people. All the power was off in town. There was no water pressure in town. That's a whole nother story. And so to establish, in essence, a base that could self-sustain up to 1,500 people, a small community, without anything actually working was one of the massive things. And it wasn't until, even on the Tuesday after the fire had started on the Friday, we had 17 active fires on the Tuesday. We're talking house fires, fully involved, those sorts of things, still going on because we had so many embers and such high winds blowing in the area. They just whip up an ember from somewhere, carry it into the town somewhere, and we had fires. And so when you talk about some of the challenges of gaining, very quickly when we tried to get situational awareness, we realized that we had limited resources to fight the fire. We used up all the water in the water reservoir, and part of that was that every home that burned, I think the numbers in the 450, 475, every home that burned had burned off its water line. And so you could walk around and you could see these charred ashes, but you'd see a little fountain of water coming up. And so we were, in essence, trying to maintain water pressure for hydrants, but we were in essence didn't have any water because we were pumping it into every one of these homes that had been burned. And so some of the initial stages of getting awareness was, what are the problems that are causing, how can we get the food into the people? How can we get water pressure to fight the fires? We knew at that point in time that we hadn't lost any people to our knowledge in the fire. And so it was sort of, how can we control this? We had a lot of pressure from external sources to allow the media in, to gain, to have them gain access and to be able to tell the story. A lot of challenges with our gates being pushed by people saying that they should have access. But really, we were at that basic life safety point of trying to get control of the base situation and understand exactly what we have.
How did the availability of information or lack of information influence decisions that were made during that response?
Well, one of the things that we did that wasn't just chance is that when we went in, uh, there was a huge void of information for us. And so one of the things that we did is a lot of the town senior administration and town staff had stayed in town to help out. And these people were remarkable. I mean, some of them had been burned out of their own homes, and they had stayed in town to help. And so what we did was we took most of our commanders and paired them with somebody from the town. And I personally had the chief administrator officer's executive assistant, and so she could inform me. I might know the decisions to make when in command about an incident, but she could bring to me that local flavor of the area. And so, I'd be sort of saying, how can we communicate with those people who are here and those people who are off site? And what Kelly did was, one of the gals, she set up a Facebook page, and she could talk to her Facebook page, and then everybody started following her on Facebook, and we were able to communicate. We had other people who would say, well, you have a problem with, the problems that I had never contemplated. Things like, by the third or fourth day, we had bears coming into town because food had started to go off that was in the houses, open windows, because it had been, relatively nice weather. And we had wildlife affecting the rescuers. And so, we needed things like all the fridges taken out of all the homes. And so they were able to plug us into the right people. And so in essence, you could get your hands on the guy who normally ran their landfill and did their sanitation services. And they could connect those dots for us. At the same time, we had to have a real process going on in the EOC. And when I did the assessment, we could have gone with, I'll call it traditional incident command, and then so an ops chief, a planning chief, all of those positions early on. But the truth of the matter was that what we had to do was conduct a very inclusive sort of incident management team focus, where we engaged all the members of the community that were there, that were allowed to be there. And so we would have these sit reps with probably 45 or 50 people there. And it was a really brutal process to go through, because I needed that meeting to take about an hour and no longer. And that was a long time if you actually think about it. And so we went through the identification of the problems, the development of some goals. And so we'd look at a SMART goal, where it's specific, it can be measured, it's actionable. You can do it in a certain time frame, and it's result based. So we'd look at those SMART goals and try and craft them and say, what are the things that we can do now? And some of them would be things like people would come up with, well, we want to be able to hold our festival this week, and it was like, wow, no, that's just not on the table. We're back over here at sort of the basic fundamentals of life. First off, I had an objective that I was going to get a steak dinner for everybody who was working, because nobody had been fed. They'd been fed sandwiches, and steak dinner is probably a really bad idea to say publicly, but it's some of those things that you really need to take care of responders when they're in those circumstances. And so we were really at the very, very basic level of, we need a place to sleep tonight, we need food to eat today, and we need to go put that fire out that's burning. And then as we matured, and I really mean that because we grew together, over a day or a day and a half, we started being able to think about some of the more long-term objectives that we could accomplish, thinking out, because really we were in a reactionary mode in those. You walk in, you don't know town, you don't know anything. You're in a reactionary mode to come up to speed. And then we were able to move to being able to project like a day out. And then we started to be able to project 3 days out. And then we were, as things were going, we were able to modify our objectives and have more far-reaching objectives. And about day 3, it was an interesting time, because on day 3, we decided that we needed to think about recovery operations. So that was We just put the fires out the previous day. And I asked for a meeting of the Tri-Council, the groups that were there. And I floated in one of our folks from Calgary who'd done recovery operations before. And we sat down with them and we said, we want to talk and we want you guys to start thinking about recovery. And they said, oh my God, we can't think about recovery. We don't have the people home yet. And we started talking about that whole concept of we're still in response mode, but we still need to think about creating a vision, a long-term vision about where we're going to take this community. And we detailed sort of a comprehensive emergency management plan, which would talk about, yes, the response continues and we keep doing that work, but we also plan not only recovery for the local authority, but long-term community restoration and rehabilitation. It's your job as council to spell out a message for the people as to where you're going and what you're doing. And yeah, your town's been burned, but we didn't want to become, and there was great danger of this, we didn't want to become sort of a Hurricane Katrina where businesses said, you know what, I don't want to do business in Slave Lake anymore. I've been flooded there once, I've been burned there once. This isn't, right? So what we wanted to do was create that sense of, this is where this community is going to rise from the ashes, and that, using that term. And this is how we'll get them to rise from the ashes. And so we sat them down, and over a couple of days, they started to create a vision where they'd become a fire smart community, where they do things that they hadn't done before, or take opportunities to build things that would protect the community that they hadn't done before, and to figure out how they could re-engage the public in coming back to Slave Lake. And one of the other things, Gene, that we adopted was that I wanted a bit of a motto. And if you look at the Gulf of Mexico, and there was, you remember, and I can't remember his name off the top, but he said, that someone interviewed him and said, what is it that you want? And he said, I just want to go home, right? And I didn't want that to be how we were sensed, right? But so what we did was we had adopted a motto that was, we don't go home until they come home, right? And that was kind of we won't. That's our focus, is we're here to get you home. And I think that really helped the people from the town that were there working with us. They understood what our objective was. But it sent a message to the people who are out of town to say they're really thinking about where we're trying to take this and what we're trying to do. And to me, that was really important and critical, quite critical messaging.
Okay, thank you. That's great. Can you recall, were there any times in the early stages of that response where you had to go ahead and make some decisions without full information, and where you had to draw really on your experience and knowledge and sort of intuition about what was needed? Or did you have information to make decisions?
Yeah, I'm a bit of a fan of, Malcolm Gladwell, the tipping point, that taking, being able to take, see something develop and take some movement forward very quickly based on what's unfolding. It's not quite as early as you wanted, but I might tell you about a hallway conversation I had. And so you can imagine that you've got a whole town, you're trying to figure out how to get it back on its feet. And I mentioned earlier just a little bit about this problem with freezers. And I had a guy come up to me and say, we need to sit down, we need to talk with you. And I said, well, we can talk in the hallway. I've got, 30 or 40 seconds here, and we'll just talk. And he said, well, I've got this guy from a disposal company, and for $880,000, he'll take away all the freezers. All we have to do is have them brought out on the street, and he'll take away all the freezers for us. He'll drain the Freon from them, get it off to the landfill, and you're spending money right, left, and center as you're going through one of these incidences. And I just looked at him. I said, "That's too much." And he looked at me, and I said, "Well, that's a lot of work." And I said, "Well," and literally it was this quick. It was, "How many homes are there here again?" And he says, "Well, there's 4,500, I don't know, 27 homes." And I said, "Well, if we did every home, that's $2,000. No, go away and bring me back another solution. I walked away from him, and the guy was really quite upset. And probably 2 hours later, he came back to me and he said, "Okay, we've sharpened our pencil. It's $430,000." And I just looked at him again and I said, "Please, no, we're not doing this." And well, I'm a member of the community, and you know, it was very very high speed and very crude mathematics. And I just sort of looked at the guy, and he came in one more time at 2:30, I think, or something like that, which was, he kept on taking, you know, half of it off, and or roughly half of it off. And I finally looked at him and I said, "I'm sorry, we're done. You're not engaged anymore. We're not going to do this business. You're on your own." And we just walked away from him. And somebody came up to me minutes later and said, "You know," and I won't name the real name, but Mark has a friend. Mark's friend will do this for less than $100,000, and he'll donate 10% of his profit back to the community and 10% back to those who have lost their homes. You want to go?" And I went, "Yeah, we'll do that. Let's just do it." And there's no tender, no RFP process, no, right? And so very quick decision making on, and so, and we ended up getting that work done for under $90,000, which included moving them to landfills. But there were decisions like that on every corner, on every time. And so I think that what you'll find is that experience is a great teacher, but also your gut. You know, there's a time when something sits right and or sits well with you or doesn't sit well with you. And I think that as your people in the class, the people who are taking this class will know, you will become leaders, and people will expect you to make an informed decision, and you can only make a decision based on the information you have at the time, and your job is to make the best one. And sometimes it's you have to look at that, you know, that priority triangle, right? You want to do it fast, good, or cheap. And and sometimes you're just doing things fast, and you don't worry about the money. But other times you need to consider that there's people in the midst of an emergency will take absolutely take advantage of you. Another story that runs with that is, you know, I have a great relationship with the RCMP, and they came to me and said, "We want to talk about the animals. There's a number of animals who are housed here in town. We want to get in and get the animals, and we'd like a letter from you because you have the delegation as the local authority, and you're in a state of local emergency, so you can provide things that they don't need. They don't need a subpoena, for example, to enter a home." And so, you know, we called on resources that were away, and I called one of our lawyers in Calgary, and I said, "Write me a letter that gives the RCMP the approval to do what they need to do." And he came back and he said, "Here's what I've done." And you know, and we got the letter, we got it all signed up, and I looked at the RCMP and I said, "We've got locksmiths. Bring some locksmiths in. We're going to open the doors, not kick them in." And you know, we averted in Slave Lake what they had happen in High River, which is, you know, the RCMP, for whatever reason, and you know, there must have been good reason, and I don't question that, but they got into a situation where they kicked a friend of mine's door in, a $1,600 door, to get his guns that were appropriately stored and safe, you know, under the Firearms Act. And so we averted those kind of things just by, I would say, just a little bit of intuition and a little bit of thinking about unintended consequences when you're running through something really quickly. I'm sure there's a million of other decisions that we made. Some of them were harder than others in terms of in the field, they made decisions as to where to focus their firefighting efforts, whether they'd let something burn to the lake in one area so that they could save property in another area. But that's really those four things, right, that we focus on. So number one priority, protect life. Number two priority, protect property, with critical infrastructure being the first part of that, and the second part being generalized property. Three being, you know, protect the environment, and the fourth, do it in an economical way. And so we did hold those priorities up in everything that we did. It was interesting, and I'll pause for a second so you can do a change. if you choose to cut this up. One of the interesting things that happened in Slave was over a period of time, the political influence changed. And so you had suddenly ministers, prime ministers, people wanting to visit the scene and wanting to be seen doing that. And those kind of things actually significantly take away from your operational work. And I think it's hard for people not to fall into the moment of, oh my God, that's the prime minister, and when you're having to work at the same time. But they also got involved in things like what we were going to release in media. And a perfect example would be we had been developing, unfortunately by hand, maps of whose home was burned, whose home was slightly damaged, and whose home was intact. And I was of the opinion that as soon as that map could be developed, we had to let that map out to people. And we had to, in a very compassionate way, say, we are so sorry, but here's the damage report that we can have, that we have. And I got a lot of pressure, and it ended up, going up to a minister, and the minister saying, "You don't release that map." And I said, "Thank you, minister." And I said, "Could you put the mayor back on?" And I said to the mayor, "Mayor, he doesn't matter to me right now. You're the mayor. I'm working for you. You're the local authority, and I'm acting on your behalf. I'm going to take your guidance on this one, but my gut is we release the map, and regardless of what the minister has said." And she said, "Tom, just do me a favor. Don't release the map." And I didn't. And I regret not having released the map. But having said that, somebody, and the truth will set you free, right? Because somebody walked over top of the map and with an iPhone, took a shot of that map and published it to Facebook. And so it was out, and I didn't do it, and I didn't have anybody do it, not even surreptitiously. But I think that there's a fundamental piece I'd say to you as students or to people in the class is that good news should travel quickly. It should always travel good. Good news should travel quickly. Bad news should travel faster. And you can't ever communicate enough to people, and you can't ever communicate fast enough. I mean, if you think about the chap who sat the plane down in the Hudson, that incident went viral in less than 4 minutes. And so you have to be on your communications game. And so people don't understand it if you're not, because it's such an instant society that we live in. And we had real trouble with that from a communications perspective. We ended up having to do bus tours because we had so much material on the ground, so much ash that you'd actually walk through. I might be exaggerating, but I was going to say 4 to 6 inches. It's probably 2 to 4 inches, but you'd be walking through that ash of all the burned buildings, and we didn't know what was toxic or what wasn't toxic. And so we fenced the community, and then we brought people in buses, and we tried to, the residents of the community, and we tried to tour them through so that they could at least see where it was, because we were starting to get pressure on our gates to say, let me back in, let me, I need to know my dog's okay, I need to know this is okay. And we needed to say to people, there's nothing there anymore. We couldn't even tell where the homes were, and I don't mean to laugh about that, but we couldn't tell where the homes were because they had burnt out so badly you couldn't really even look at a map and identify where you were. And so we got the place up with GPS cameras, and we GPS shot every single thing. We had to make YouTube videos of police and other rescuers combing through the ashes so that people could be convinced that they wouldn't find, grandma's necklace or anything else that was in that rubble. We didn't have enough water to put out the basements. We had to empty the basements. We literally did that with front end loaders and those sorts of things, and extinguish it once we put it out. And of course that negated people's capacity to go back and have proper closure. And so we videotaped every one of those that we did just so that we could try and provide closure for people afterwards, right? And so I'll stop and pause for a second and give you a chance to ask another question.
This is great. Well, it's so rich in terms of information you're sharing. Thank you. Um, was there anything unique or novel about this event? Like, if you look at your experience in terms of decision making, was there anything unique or novel that stood out for you?
I think one of the things that I learned over time, and I believe that I cemented it in Slave Lake, is when I conduct a sit rep in the EOC, and when I'm at the end, I generally ask three questions. And while I generally ask these three questions, every time you'd ask me, I'd phrase them differently. But the three questions go like this. The first one is, um, what are we not thinking about right now? Right? And I stand there and I kind of get my arms across and I look at him and go, what am I not thinking about? What are we not thinking about? Right? Second question is, who have we not involved? Right? That should be involved. Right? And the third question is, who do we need to tell that maybe we haven't told? Right? And like I said, they always come out slightly different, but there's predominantly there's three questions in there. And the thing that I'd say to you is that no incident commander, no leader actually has all the answers. And that the strength of a team, when you assemble a team, when your students go out there and they're on the pin, you are not the strength of the team. The team is the strength of the team, and the team will give you what you need. And the engagement of the team, so the engagement of the team in those three questions is absolutely crucial, because somebody will look at you and say, you know, I think it's just great that we've been putting these fires out, and I'm really happy that we've been doing this, but you know, we've absolutely missed the fact that no one's been running, you know, nothing's happening over at the septic's pumping station, and we're about to damage it, you know, or whatever it might be. Some most ridiculous things come out. But if you've asked them those questions, a couple of things happen. Number one, they're allowed to speak up outside their turf, right? So if it's the police, they can talk about a fire issue. Or if you're public works, you can talk about a police issue, because you're allowed to say, what are we not thinking of, or have we thought of it? So you're allowed to challenge. The second thing that happens by doing that is better decision making is made. And it doesn't have to be a long process, but sometimes it's, yeah, we got that. But other times it's, wow, we didn't think of that. And the third piece that does, and you might say this is bureaucratic, but there's a piece there about, well, I asked you, why didn't you tell me, right? And so when you're doing that post-event analysis report or after-action report, whatever term you use, people say, you know what, I really appreciated that you asked me. You asked me what we weren't thinking about. And it prevents that big piece of somebody coming around the back of you and saying to you, you guys, you totally missed this, as opposed to, you asked us at the end of every session what we were missing, what we weren't thinking of, what we hadn't done. There's one more piece in that, and a rule that I've developed out of this is that if you come into my EOC, nobody gets to fail, right? And there's a silly little game you can play, and it's a bunch of people, maybe it's your classmates. You all stand in a circle, and you all know each other's names because you've been going to school for how long together. And you clap your hand and you point at the next person. You say, Tom, Jean, and you go around the room. And every time, if I point at Jean, then Jean has to point at somebody else and clap. And you go faster and faster and faster. And as you go faster and faster, people start to fail with people they've known every day. And the illustrative example there is that under pressure, under huge pressure, people start to fail, right? And they don't remember things that they should have remembered. They told their wife they'd call them, they didn't call them, or whatever else it might be. Fundamental things get forgotten. And so with the rule that nobody gets to fail in the EOC, it is that we will prop you up. So if you come in, and we had what we called snow timber here in Calgary, which was a $40 million snowfall that occurred before the fall equinox, you know, in September. Obviously, the deciduous leaves all had their branches on them, big snowfall, a $40 million problem. And you know, the capacity to get information was tough. We were right across the whole city, but we brought in a parks manager. He'd never been in an EOC, and really he was kind of the lead agency. It's a parks issue, and he wasn't doing as well as he might have been doing, and so we kind of picked up the phone and called somebody else, and I put a couple of planners under him, and so the planners supported him, and it still wasn't going well. So I brought in another guy of his same level from urban forestry, and I put that person under him, and the end result was this guy did exceedingly well, right? But he was simply overwhelmed. He'd just been overwhelmed. And so I argue that one of the things I learned and I now put into place, it's kind of a rule here, nobody gets to fail, is that you will make if you go into a program and you're not going to fail, that they've got your back, right? It's like being on a team that you've never been on before, because nobody wants to see you go down. Nobody will let you go down. And as a result, you make better decisions. And so you're in the clap test and going around and saying Gene and Tom, and if you stumble on a name, somebody says the name for you, right? It's Bob. Perfect. You didn't. And you know what? I know it sounds ridiculous, but I think those three questions they're critical to ask. It provides engagement. It makes sure you're not missing things, and that stance of you don't get to fail in my EOC. Allows you to stand strong. I've had people come to us after the flood and say, that was the highlight of my 25 years. I've never, ever been able to work in an environment where I could get so much done so quickly. I wish we had a flood all the time, right? Because I felt like I contribute. Most people, if you survey them, you survey the average business person and you say, how much does your employer utilize your skills? Most people will say something, and this is amazingly disappointing to me, but they'll say something, from 0 to 35%, my employer utilizes my skills. In an EOC that I run, I want to use 110% of what you've got to give me, right? And I'll do anything I can. I'll make sure you're fed like royalty. We'll drive you home if you need to. We'll do whatever we can to support you so that I can get. And it's selfish. I want 110% of your brain to focus on this problem so that we can get out of this thing as quickly as possible. And that goes back to that whole thing about, begin with the end in mind, right? That Stephen Covey line, right? Of know where you're trying to go, know where you're trying to get to, and make sure that each one of your objectives as you start. When you start, they're so basic, right? They're so basic, like let's get a perimeter and, let's make sure everybody's safe. But if you're really doing a good job, your objectives become, let me give you an example. In the midst of the flood, right, on about the fourth day of the flood, I turned to my boss and I said, we need to get the stampede board in here, right? What for? Well, the stampede's in, I think it was in 13 days. What if we could get the stampede board in and they could run the stampede? And so we brought the stampede board in, and the deal was, you guys get the stampede going. We'll fix the road out front and we'll repair the rail and we'll have it ready to go. And our roads guys, they fixed McLeod Trail, which was it's 4 lanes at that point. They fixed 4 lanes in 1 day, right? No approvals because we're under a state of local emergency. Right? And we took our rail construction crew. They were extending our light rail transit for Northwest Calgary. We took them, reassigned them, no change in their contract, and we put them down in front of the stampede grounds and repaired the stampede grounds. And so people love that, and they love and that thinking out in advance of what you can do and how you can symbolize, right? Because everybody thinks all the money's on the big trucks and going to the call and the response. But actually, the big money's on how quickly can you recover? How quickly can you come out of it? And how quickly can you get your community, that actual community restoration and rehabilitation back on board? If I digress, remember the SARS incident in Toronto, and SARS went around the first time in Toronto, and they said that they fixed it. They got SARS under control and everything was good. Toronto was a safe place to travel to again. And then SARS came back around. And even our own Canadian government was saying, don't travel to Toronto. It's not safe right now. SARS, there's an outbreak of SARS. And when you talk about recovery, what had to happen in Toronto is they had to actually bring the Rolling Stones in, do an outdoor concert to prove to people that it was safe to come back, that Calgary was a valid and place to go as a tourist destination, and that it was okay. If you begin with end in mind, you're talking about not only how you, when you're done this, how you get, you fix everything that's broken, but how do you turn a disadvantage into an advantage? How do you turn this disaster into a good thing and come out at least as high as you were, or perhaps like Slave Lake, you come out higher? You're a fire smart community, or whatever else you've built in terms of resilience moving forward.
You're touching on lots of other little themes that are important that we address, and that whole piece around that sort of having that vision of the outcome, right, and thinking that through, and then having that drive the actions that you take is a really critical component that we dwell on. So you've covered that really nicely. Let's switch. Maybe just to conclude Slave Lake, tell me about the exit from Slave Lake. Like, how did you know when time was done, and what was that transition like?
And that's so the exit from Slave Lake was an interesting one, and I did tap out after the first 5 days and brought my own teams in to replace us, and that was about personal survival for me, and a very emotional time actually, because I sort of looked at we were doing transfer of command, and I looked at one of the fellows and I said, it's just been tough, right? Like every corner, every turn has been, we didn't have food for a while, and and then we could bring food in, but we couldn't refrigerate. And then I talked about all the challenges that we'd have, and I said, but the one thing is, we haven't killed anybody. Like we have, we've got all, and I think we had 1,596 responders in town at that point in time, and I said, I guess I can say we haven't killed anybody, and I'm really proud of that. And I kid you not, less than 20 minutes later, we got reports that a helicopter had just gone down and that there was no signs of life. And it's amazing. I've been a medic for so long, and I've dealt with so much death and destruction, and I cannot believe the impact that had on me. You're getting on the plane flying home, right? And you're in tears because you've kind of. There was one thing I was holding up, is that I may not have had all these other successes, but I'd at least had this one thing, that I hadn't caused anybody to lose their life. And as it turned out in the investigation, he was bucketing out of the water, out of a calm lake, and he had a little bit more forward drift in his helicopter than he thought. And of course, the bucket grabbed and he drove himself into the ground. And terrible situation. And one pilot did pass away, a Frenchman. But so we did the first week, and we tapped out. We came back in the Sunday night. We did the next week, and we made a mistake. And that was, we tapped out at the end of that week, and we went back to Calgary that was having some flooding, and we assumed that they were ready to take over, and that in these 2 weeks' time, that they were ready to drop their state of local emergency, that they were ready to consider the problems that they had. We've got the community, we've got the people in the community home. We analyzed, did we need a state of local emergency any longer? Because you only need it. The state of local emergency gives you this sort of absolute power package. But we sort of said, well, I'm not really sure we need the absolute power package. We can manage it without a state of local emergency, and so we kind of we talked about what some long-term objectives should be, and we tapped out, and the idea was, okay, you guys will continue on, and we left too early, and the net result was they went out of their state of local emergency, but then quickly renewed it and just said we need to continue on. And I've noticed that on several large events. If we do the Calgary Stampede every year with 300,000 people in it, generally that parade starts at 9. It's pretty much done by 11. And if I let responders go and let the folks go from the EOC, I'll get burned at 11:30 or 12 o'clock by leaving too early, tapping out too early, as I say it. But so mine would be, and even after the flood, mine would be decide on a date that you think you can end your state or local emergency, and then try and develop in advance what would be the triggers that would let you say you can end, right? So triggers might be, I don't actually need the powers of the state or local emergency anymore, or I might not need the purchase. Well, I guess it's still powers, but the purchasing capacity that I have. I don't have to tender anything when I'm not in a state or local emergency, so I can just go get more cats or whatever else I want. So really, those are about the fun. I don't need that strength. But then the second piece would be the people. Are the people themselves that are going to take over from you, are they capable of handling it? And because the people that we handed off to were the people of Slave Lake. And the people of Slave Lake, some of them had lost their own homes. And some of them had not been home in 14 days, from our arrival. And so if to do it again, I would have said, you know what, we have all these triggers. These are the things that we think that we need into place. You've got other underpinnings, you've got federal government help, or, there's so many things I could have done. So, it sounds like I'm so critical, but I should have arranged for a deputy chief administrative officer. I should have arranged for additional finance people to be their underpinning, recruited from other communities. While we're still in the state of local emergency, people who would come in for a 6-month term, and they would be trained by us in that last week or whatever else as to what had unfolded. It would be a protracted transfer of command. But I think that much as they were very gracious and said thank you, and I think if I was self-critiquing, I would say don't pull too quickly, don't run away too fast. The whole community it benefits from that kind of tempo that you've got going, and you can't just cut it off once you've started it.